Hello again, everybody. I'm back with a new game today. Or rather, a new old game. Advance Wars 2. One of my favorite strategy games of all time. To introduce myself to newcomers, I do challenge runs of games that I enjoy. You can expect me to talk about a wide variety of topics, including strategy, and the artwork and story, and game mechanics, especially the hidden ones. One reason I decided to make this series is that I discovered, to my shock and horror, that I couldn't find a good max ranking run of the game's campaigns. Alright, let's roll out. I played this game before Advance Wars 1. I found it a little bit confusing at first, but dropped into the setting with no knowledge of the characters or story. People who played the previous game will recognize most of these characters on sight. I'm sure it was an intentional choice to put the new member of each of these nations in the most prominent position, to pique the curiosity of people who played Advance Wars 1. Although they're not as firmly the main characters as they were in the previous game, the Orange Star Seals still get their names displayed the most prominently, as do our new enemies. It's a fine opening, of course, but it is also kind of odd to me that it functions so much like a trailer for a game that you're already playing. I always find it odd when games do that. Well, time to start a new campaign and get right into the tutorial. Sadly, that is not skippable. One minor fault of the campaign. But I would play it anyway for the benefit of newcomers to the series. Out of the entire Advance Wars series, this one is probably the least focused on an overarching story. Instead, it's very episodic, but I think that works quite well, actually. Macroland is the new group of continents for this game, as opposed to Cosmoland from the previous game. So here we have Sturm, our main villain, and his right-hand man, Hawk. We'll be seeing a lot more of them later on in the game, but they won't make too many appearances in the first act. CO stands for Commanding Officer, by the way, an important game mechanic. I'll talk about that later. Who you have as the commander in each given mission influences which troops are useful in a lot of different ways. With a name like Wars World, you can tell they took their setting very seriously. He recaps the entire plot of Advance Wars 1 in about 3 sentences. When I was totally new to the series, the references to Cosmoland confused me a little bit. I appreciate, by the way, that though neither game is very story-focused, they did make the stories distinct. And as far as little cartoon war game plots go, this one makes about as much sense as most of them. In a shocking plot twist, he will fail him. So Orange Star is sort of our main country, and we have Andy here, our series mascot and kid appeal character. I suspect that he's partly here to make kids feel smart, because he's a blithering idiot. Sammy, our much more competent Special Forces commander. And Max is sort of the tank commander. Sturm did explicitly say that he would be back at the end of the previous game, so it shouldn't be a huge surprise. Now, the way it's pointing at a spot on the map used to make me think that they were actually in that location at the time of this conversation, but they're not. They're on another continent. It's all a good deal clearer if you played the first game first, I'm sure. It would have been neat to see a map of Cosmoland regardless with the game's updated graphics, I suppose. As I said, Andy is amazingly dumb. Last game he didn't know what airports are, now he doesn't know that continents exist, but they keep putting him in charge of armies for some reason. Max himself is not the very brightest, but he's in a different league than Andy. Often Sammy is the voice of reason in this little trio. Nell even more so. She's the commander-in-chief of Orange Star in this game. I think in the previous one she had unspecified superiors, but she must have been promoted. I'm sure you can see a pattern to the names here. It is a little bit odd to me that, although Black Hole comes from another world, they have the exact same naming convention for their country. This series has always had something of a tension to it, between it being on the one hand a very cartoonish game, and full of characters who actively enjoyed the war and treat it as a fun excursion, and on the other hand often telling us that war is very serious. Doesn't quite mesh. Of course, Days of Ruin, the last game in the series, mostly fixed all that by just going all in on being dark and gritty. It had a much more complex story too. One of my favorite video game stories, actually. But unfortunately, its campaign was really quite easy. Advance Wars 2 is more challenging, so that's why I'm playing it. I consider this one to be the toughest and therefore the most fun in the entire series. A decent explanation here, I think, for why we're going to have a tutorial. After all these officers are veterans of several wars by now. All in all, I would call that a reasonably effective intro. We met all the characters and learned their personalities. Alright. So, for the tutorial mission, we'll be playing as Andy against, as you can see down there, Flak. We'll be climbing the ranks of enemy competence as the game goes along, starting off with Flak and ending with Hawk and Sturm. Fortunately, we do meet the more interesting enemies before we finish the Orange Star campaign. Flak is not much of a challenge. Notice, by the way, that this black hole soldier is some kind of alien, whereas Flak looks like a human. To this day, I'm not sure I fully understand that. Are these human commanders for the Black Hole Army, human Quislings who joined them? But if so, some of Adder's lines don't make much sense later. I guess the alternative is that the Black Hole planet, wherever it may be, has two species on it. These guys in the bubblehead tanks, and then also the humans. Regardless, they're called otherworldly invaders, but it always struck me as odd that no one ever really talks about trying to find their spaceships or anything like that. Making things even more confusing, in Advance Wars 1 they just looked like generic Orange Star guys. Except painted black. There's Nell, who as I said is the Commander-in-Chief of Orange Star as of this game. No idea what happened to her unspecified superiors. Maybe she killed them. Don't know how promotions work in Orange Star. One minor thing I quite liked is that they took the time to make the soldiers of each side look different. In the dialogue screens, and on the map, and in battle animations, everywhere. A very minor thing, but I enjoyed that. As a new player, I was always interested to see what each unit type would look like for a new nation. You can see their troops over there in the top right. We outnumber them rather decisively this time. Not much showing off to do on this mission, for me or Andy. Unfortunately, there's some rather clumsy "as you know, Bob" type dialogue in these initial missions. Of course Andy already knows that he's a mechanical wizard. It's not even relevant to the subject. But of course, for people like me who hadn't played Advance Wars 1, it was new information. So, as I said, this is a turn-based strategy. Day 1 just means turn 1. They insistently say orange, but it looks pretty red to me. That's a localization thing, actually. I'll talk about that later. They highlight the HQ when talking about our victory objectives, but we almost certainly won't do that. On this particular mission, you'd have to go out of your way to not win by routing the enemy troops before you can capture the HQ. In any case, those are the two usual victory conditions. A lot of missions will mix it up, though, with different things, which I appreciate. I'm going to skim through this stuff pretty fast. Even new folks don't need to know what buttons I'm pressing. Infantry serves several crucial roles, as we'll see. For one thing, they're the mainstay of your economy. They also do a good job of blocking the enemy. You remember something from 10 seconds ago, well done. I'd say you get a gold star, Andy, but there are no CO powers in this mission. A lot of the information they're throwing out here is not really relevant to the battle at hand, unfortunately, so they have to rehash some of it on future missions. As we go along, I will, as I said, talk about some of the more secretive mechanics in the game and how they work. These controls are pretty typical for turn-based strategy games, of course, and very reminiscent of Fire Emblem also. That's not a coincidence, the two series are made by the same game studio. Some of you may actually know me from my Let's Play of Fire Emblem 7, but I got my start with Advance Wars and discovered Fire Emblem later. Classic Andy, saying weird dumb lines every game. He should certainly know what APCs did from the previous war where they were even more important. In that game they were incredibly useful, because besides supplying your troops and transporting your infantry, the enemy AI had a bizarre obsession with them and would attack them over any other target. It was stupid and very predictable, and thus very useful to a human player who knew about it. The AI is a good deal smarter in this game, one of the many things I like about it. It continued to get better as the series went on, of course. The APC is pretty much worthless on this map in particular, so it's not really great writing to talk so much about it now. This stuff about fuel and ammo doesn't really apply to this mission. No unit on this map can run out of ammo, and to run them out of fuel I would have to mindlessly run them back and forth for 33 turns. For that matter, it is pretty rare for any unit to run out of fuel or ammo. It does happen under certain circumstances, so APCs do have that niche role, but that's not the main thing you use them for. We'll get into all that stuff later on, of course. Okay, the way we move doesn't really matter much in this mission. Let's just advance and get it done with faster. I appreciate, by the way, that they don't auto-end your turn after you finish moving. A lot of games do that, and it can be logical, but I at least often like to look over the map after my turn has ended. Not fun for the troops, I would think. Now, as I said, we have a huge numbers advantage here. We can't really lose. Especially because we're not facing Sturm. He would have super strong units, unlike Flak. Flak is our dumb brute enemy who we fight a lot in these opening missions, before he makes way for more interesting enemies in a couple of chapters. In these early chapters, which CO you're playing against wouldn't really make much of a difference anyway, but it certainly can later on. Basically this means melee units versus ranged units. Almost everything in the game is a melee unit, only 4 units in the whole game are indirect, and 2 of them are almost useless. Nonetheless, the remaining 2 are very important. This is a crucial tip too. Unlike in a lot of games, injured troops don't fight very well. Whoever strikes first can often win in this game, and setting up first strikes is a key part of strategy. First strike usually even matters more than defensive terrain. This stuff is not important right now, let me try to skim through it. Now tactics don't really matter here, but just to demonstrate good ones, I'm going to put my useless APC out here as bait. In order to fight him, that enemy will have to walk into an open plain surrounded by better terrain, so that will give me every possible advantage against him. APCs have no real decrease to their functionality when they take damage anyway, because they don't fight. On later missions, taking some damage on them can actually have other benefits too. Taking damage is the main thing that helps you charge up your very important CO power on later missions. Well, perfect. I lured his infantry into non-mutually supporting positions. So I'll walk into this forest while he's on the plain and I'll have the advantage of both first strike and terrain. That 49% means I'll deal 49% of his maximum HP. So as you might expect, he dropped from about 10 to about 5. Now notice, as this next guy attacks, that it's not 49% anymore, it's now 52. I'll talk about the exact details later on, but basically if you're injured you don't get the full benefit of whatever terrain you're standing on. I will once again use the APC as bait. This time I'll lure him out onto a road, the very worst kind of terrain. Even worse than plains. Terrain only does two things in this game, by the way: grant defense and restrict movement. As expected, he took the bait. So, I will attack now from this forest, leaving the other one open. Notice that I deal even more damage than I did before because he's on a road rather than a plain, so he's even less defense. Notice also that instead of reducing him to 5, I reduced him to 4. That is actually an effect of the very secret luck mechanic in this game. Also notice that I don't deal increased damage this time. Because contrary to what some people think, it's not that being at low HP makes your defense overall suffer, it makes you less capable of taking advantage of good terrain. Now and then that's an important distinction. And with that we have our first glorious victory. The enemy always escapes without good explanation, even if you capture their HQ. Easy mission though it was, I think I talked about a few useful things at least, and I'm looking forward to the more challenging rest of the campaign. There we go, a perfect 300-point score. You'll be seeing a lot of that. I'll talk about how to get a good score on the future missions. I also have always liked the little background drawings and the unique victory quotes for each commander in each mission. Pretty cool stuff, I think. Well, that's that. To allay any fears of fans of my other series, I will be continuing those on schedule. Have a great day, everyone.